Okay, well, it's 9:31, and I think we might as well get going. We have a lot of material to cover. And first of all, welcome to today's talk on moving the goalposts. Again, navigating the ever-changing landscape of returning to the office during COVID. My name's Rob Brooks, and I'm a partner here in the Labor and Employment Group at Verrill Dana, joined by my colleague Emily Waddell, who is going to be presenting with me today. You could probably see, maybe in the spirit of the topic, I'm in my office. I'm in the office today downtown in Portland, and Emily is at home. So this is sort of a perfect example of the modern workplace during COVID and perhaps beyond. We have a few housekeeping items to discuss before we get going. First of all, with respect to education credits for SHRM, those credits have been approved, and so we were all set on that front, and you'll be getting the information in a thank you email from us afterwards. With respect to credits for the main bar, we are waiting to get the confirmation of that from the main bar, which should come any day, and we expect that we'll be sending that to you soon. And information in a link, again, as part of a thank you email after today's presentation. You'll see that we are also recording this, so this presentation will be available online on our website at a later date. So, and our materials are also going to be available as well on the slide deck. So if you have any trouble accessing those materials, just let us know, and we'll be happy to send them to you directly. So you'll also see that everyone should be muted with respect to their microphones. We've got that covered. But if you do have questions, we'd certainly encourage you to ask them during the presentation using the chat box, and we'll be monitoring that. And if possible, we will answer them as we go. But if necessary, we may just wait till the end to try to get to them. And if we can't, we'll follow up directly with you afterward. So with those housekeeping issues, one other housekeeping issue. As you know, this is part of our annual update series. We used to do annual updates on one day in January, but during the pandemic, we've broken up the various sessions into monthly webinars. And so the next webinar is going to be on May 19. So mark your calendars for that. So without any further delay, why don't we head into our agenda? We do have a lot to talk about today, and concerning the things we want to cover, again, all related to going back to the office in a more, I guess, routine or standard practice. And it seems as though this has been just a total roller coaster the last couple of years. I don't have to tell you how challenging it's been for employers to navigate operating a business with employees during the last 2 years. As a law firm, we're no exception. We have employees, and we've been facing the same struggles that all of you have. And to say that it's been a constantly changing environment would be an understatement. From the beginning, it was just 2 weeks. In 2 weeks to flatten the curve. We'll be right back by April 1st. Well, I guess April Fool's was maybe literal, if the joke was on us. Who remembers the Families First Coronavirus Response Act? I mean, that was a big deal. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out that statute and how people could qualify for paid time off under that law. I mean, that's like a distant memory now. Then you had the ARPA, that Response Act, that Relief Act with all of its components. We've had OSHA mandates that have been implemented and gone to the court and been voided. Executive orders, same thing. And the court decisions keep coming out as recently as, well, the mask mandates last week with the federal judge in Florida knocking out the transportation related mask wearing requirements. And we've certainly, the kerfuffle over that has been significant. So it has just been a not to overuse the word crazy, but it's been a crazy environment the last couple of years, and it's been extremely difficult for everyone, including us as lawyers, to try to give advice to our clients on how to navigate this tumultuous environment. And so here we are again. It's April 2022. We're 2 years plus into this, and it seems as though there's maybe some real traction in terms of getting back to I don't know, I hate the phrase new normal, it's overused, but to a new way of doing business, getting people back in gradually. We've had a lot of fits and starts in the last couple of years. People have been setting deadlines. Hey, we're going to be back by September 1st. I know we were like that, only to have that deadline pushed off. And so, the theme of today is, how things keep changing. We're going to do our best to try to give you a status report as to what things are today and where we think things are going. So in terms of what we want to cover, we are going to do a brief overview of the current legal landscape about returning to the office. What's the status of the various mandates, rules, executive orders. Then we're going to just touch on just some considerations with respect to updating your current COVID policy. I'm not going to say you need to draft a new COVID policy. I think everyone's already got one. This is really more focused on updating it. What's the current CDC guidance? You want to talk about things that have been changing constantly in the last couple of years. Here's another thing that's been hard to stay on top of. We're going to give you at least what the current status is of those. We're also going to talk about assessing and managing risk during, risk of COVID-related claims. And this is something that we are going to take a little bit of time to analyze, because it's really important and it's key to what you do. It's what we do. How do we evaluate risk, and how has that changed in the last 2 years? Is the way we look at risk from COVID-related claims the same today as it was 2 years ago? No. By way of preview, the answer is not. I don't think so. So we're just going to go look at some of those considerations to help you figure out what may be the best path for your business. We're also going to take a look at revisiting vaccine mandates. That's obviously been very controversial and momentous. So that's something we'll touch on in terms of what the current state of affairs are with mandates. We're going to talk about mask requirements apropos of the travel ban, and then finally get into some legal implications with respect to remote work. Again, some of this is you may be familiar with, but I think we want to make sure you're familiar with some of the more important issues that may be lurking out there for you if you have some part of your workforce working from home, and especially if they're working in other states. And then lastly, just a few considerations about the post-pandemic workplace, hybrid workplace, things like hiring and retention. And that should take the full hour, sort of 51 minutes to go. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily now, who will move on to the current legal landscape.
Great, thank you, Rob. So when we think about, where we are now from a legal perspective when it comes to COVID, as Rob mentioned, there's certainly a lot that has happened over the last 2 years. So hopefully this will serve as a helpful guide to kind of hit the highlights, if you will, of what has happened most recently and also what has been perhaps most impactful for your businesses. So first, let's start with some vaccine mandates. So the federal contractor mandate remains under a nationwide injunction, and currently that case is pending before the 11th Circuit. The outcome of this is undecided, obviously, since it's pending. You will see a lot of legal analysts that say that they think that it's not going to be enacted, but we can't really, officially make a call on that until it is ultimately decided. The OSHA ETS, you might remember this one as the ETS that was going to impact employers with over 100 employees. OSHA has withdrawn that temporary standard following the Supreme Court striking down that ETS. However, this still actually remains a proposed rule under OSHA, while the agency focuses on finalizing a permanent COVID-19 healthcare standard. So while that's still out there, it is worth noting that normally rulemaking is a very lengthy process. So it's unclear when a formalized rule would be available and or enacted. But just so you know, it is still live, if you will. The Supreme Court upheld the mandated vaccines for healthcare workers who work in facilities with federal funding. And also various state mandates for covered healthcare workers have been upheld. specifically in Maine, Massachusetts, and New York. Moving on to mask mandates, we know that Boston and Portland's mandates have been lifted, Portland in February and Boston in March, and certainly in other cities around the Northeast and around the country that aren't included on this slide. And as Rob mentioned, we do most recently have the CDC order for masking on public transportation, which has been enjoined and is now under appeal. Finally, we also in this new, not to say new normal, but in this realm have federal guidance as well that we have to consider. So we have the CDC guidance, which we will be talking about extensively later in this presentation, which I unfortunately have more familiarity with this week than I would have liked to. And then we also have the DLL guidance, which concerns temperature checks, what type of time is paid or unpaid as it concerns to testing in the workplace. So a lot to kind of take in as you are looking at updating your COVID policies, which we will talk about on the next slide. Okay, so, as Rob mentioned, it's safe to say that after 2 years of this going on, it's probably going to be pretty hard to find an employer who, doesn't have a COVID policy enacted already. So really this is meant to kind of highlight for you, what could potentially be in a policy or what elements of your existing policy you might want to take another look at as we kind of progress throughout this time. So ideally, the policy is going to help provide guidance to employees in case of infection or exposure. And you as the employer have the option to mandate vaccines, as we've talked about before, including boosters, obviously subject to the need to accommodate legally protected rights. Some other elements to consider at your organization: are you going to require masks? Are you going to prohibit masks? Will you have social distancing measures in place or not? And will you consider treating employees equally versus treating people differently based on their vaccinated status? This last point here is really more of a drafting point as you're working through your policy or perhaps considering some amendments. Do you want to draft this in a way where it's not exclusively mentioning COVID, but do you want to broaden this to make sure it's generally applicable to, infectious disease prevention? For example, the flu or, other illnesses that might spread through your population at your company. So just something to keep in mind there. But something as you are, considering what to include or what to update, I would imagine that many of you are looking to the CDC guidance. So we're going to flip to the next slide, and I'm going to give you guys a quick highlight of what is included in that today. So first of all, with vaccines, right now the CDC is recommending that everyone eligible should stay up to date on vaccines, including people with weakened immune systems. In terms of boosters, up to date on vaccines encompasses, eligible people getting the booster in their schedule of dosages, depending on what their original vaccine was, and all of those requirements are a little bit different. And now people can get 2 boosters if they meet certain criteria. So the CDC says if you're over the age of 50 or you're over 12 years old and immunocompromised, whether that's moderately or severely immunocompromised, or individuals who got 1 primary dose and 1 booster of the J&J vaccine should be, considering those options. For masking, the CDC recommends that everyone 2 years or older should wear a well-fitting mask indoors in public where the COVID community level is high, regardless of vaccination status, to stop the spread. Next slide, please. As it relates to social distancing, the CDC recommends unvaccinated people maintain social distancing procedures. And when we come to testing, testing after exposure to COVID-19 is encouraged regardless of vaccination status. After an individual comes into contact with someone that has COVID, if they aren't up to date on their vaccinations, they should quarantine for 5 days pending taking a test. And if you are vaccinated, there's no need to quarantine for those 5 days, but you should be taking a test on that 5th day. Now, regardless of vaccination status, if someone who's been exposed tests positive, they should isolate for 5 days, and they can end their isolation period if they're fever-free for 24 hours without the use of fever-reducing medication and your symptoms are improving. Or if you get very sick from COVID-19 or have a weakened immune system, again, regardless of vaccination status, you should continue to isolate for at least 10 days. So there's a lot of information there, but that is, the highlights, if you will, of the CDC's current guidance. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob to talk through if your policy needs to conform to this guidance.
Thanks, Emily. So, people talk a lot about the CDC guidance. I know employers have looked to that agency and relied heavily on that agency's recommendation. And I think in large part, they've done that because they perceive that it's a safe place to stand. If I follow what the CDC recommends, then nobody could blame me for anything that happens while I've got this policy in place. So for instance, if I've got a customer who comes in and they get sick and they say that, well, geez, one of your employees must have given it to me. You can say, hey, no, I follow the CDC guidance. I didn't do anything wrong. So, and that's been, I think, the default decision-making mechanism, for lack of a better phrase, for many employers. And it's not irrational, but even in some respects, I do think there are limits to that analysis and that reliance. And so we're going to spend a few minutes talking about when it makes sense to follow the CDC's guidance and when it doesn't. It's worth noting that the CDC guidance, it's not mandatory. As the court actually, the court demonstrated last week in Florida, they struck it down. That was actually more than just guidance from the CDC. They attempted to make a rule, but with respect to this, the COVID recommendations that Emily just went over, is just a recommendation. You can follow it. You don't have to. There's no penalty that's coming from the CDC for not doing it. But what I think it does is that it creates what we call a standard of care, and that's used in litigation matters where if you're accused of negligence, basically, if you're negligent, you're deviating from the standard of care, and therefore, you are vulnerable to any damage that could be reasonably foreseeable from that deviation or that breach of care. So, as you probably discovered under the last couple of years, that sometimes the CDC guidance butts up against other legal obligations, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute, such as obligations to accommodate people with medical or religious barriers to complying with the CDC recommendations, and other business necessities. I think a lot of employers like, well, geez, if I follow everything that the CDC says I do, have to, like with 6 foot social distancing or quarantining, for the X amount of days after somebody's been around or exposed to somebody with COVID, I'll be out of business. I can't run a business that way. So that's been a source of frustration and anxiety for a lot of companies in the last couple of years. So again, we're going to look at in the next few slides, like with respect to these CDC recommendations, does it still make sense to follow them in sort of a lockstep, or are there times or when you may want to cautiously and prudently deviate? So with that, why don't we go to the next slide? And yes, great. So with respect to the risk analysis, and again, this is all about risk. What are we? Again, it's your risk of getting sued by. Well, who is it? Who's going to sue you? And I think this is something that has not always been done by a lot of businesses in the last couple of years. I think there's a reflex like, oh my God, we got to do with the CDC because we might get sued. But they don't think, well, who's going to sue us? All right. Well, there's a there's a universe of people who could sue an employer for some harm coming out of the uh, arising out of COVID. One is a customer. Like as I said a minute ago, one example is a customer says, "Hey, you jeopardized my health because you weren't following CDC guidance. When I got sick, it must have been because of one of your employees gave it to me." A customer could be whether it's somebody walking into a coffee shop, or it could be you run a gym. It could be someone at a gym. If you're running a healthcare facility, it could be a patient. Guests is another category of person who could sue you. Employees, of course, that's something that's important to everybody on this call. Students would fall into this category of who could sue for a deviation from the standard of care. Family members of customers, or employees or students. And early on in the pandemic, we had stories of some meatpacking plants where several members or many members of that staff got ill. They came home, they got sick, they died, and their family members were suing the meatpacking companies for basically loss of consortium and wrongful death. In those cases, got a lot of attention early on. And then another possible plaintiff is a government agency like OSHA or some other state regulatory body that says you're not operating in a way that's safe. So that's the basic list of people who could sue you, and each one of those potential plaintiffs has a different risk analysis, as we'll discuss in a minute. Next slide. So with respect to, each one of these, what's the claim that they're going to make? So for customers, guests, students, if you are associated with a school, and let's say that the typical claim is going to be, I got COVID infection from your negligence. You didn't have the employees wearing masks. You didn't make them get vaccinated. You didn't, you didn't have the plastic or, plexiglass screens up. You didn't have the hand sanitizers, something like that. That's that claim, a negligence claim. What's another claim? An employee could claim that they got infection because of exposure to work. So work created, a situation that that led to the elevation of the risk of getting infected for COVID. We saw this a lot in healthcare, but also in other places where you have employees who were working or interacting with members of the public, and because that was an essential part of their job, they couldn't do it remotely. And so that's another claim. And that's, by the way, employee claims because they got COVID infection due to work doesn't necessarily require a showing of negligence. Under the workers' comp system, that's a no-fault system. So employees don't have to prove negligence. So that's that second category of claim. So employees get sued for that kind of injury, if you will, work-related infection. Employees claiming they were unlawfully denied accommodations is another kind of claim that comes out of COVID, and that's a totally different analysis, or very different analysis, from a negligence claim. And we've talked about CDC guidance on that. We'll talk about that in another slide later, but that's a different kind of claim, a different kind of risk, different kind of exposure on those claims. A fifth category of claim could be an employee claiming they were injured from a vaccine that was mandated by the employer. And we have seen a few of those. To the extent that they're covered by workers' comp, the workers' comp carriers are denying those claims. But it's worth remembering that about a year ago, when the vaccines were being rolled out, that there was a memo put out by OSHA that said that if employers mandate a vaccine, the COVID vaccine, that if an employee misses a day or more from work because of the side effects of the vaccine, that would be an OSHA reportable injury or recordable injury. I'm going to go in the log, because it's been a longstanding policy of that agency and most state agencies that if you require a medical procedure for work, including a vaccine, and vaccines certainly in healthcare have been required for many, many years, that adverse side effects from those vaccines are work-related recordable injuries. So OSHA got a lot of pushback from that about a year ago when they published that notice, and they said that okay, never mind, because the pushback was, well, hey, this is going to discourage employers from mandating vaccines, and the administrator shouldn't want employers to mandate vaccines, and so OSHA said, okay, we're not going to. We're going to retract that notice for now, but what we're doing is we're just going to delay enforcing it for a year. So it's been a year. So to the extent that you have employees who claim to have a adverse side effect from a vaccine that you've mandated, then that may be in fact now a OSHA recordable injury. So just to give you a reminder on that. And then what's another source of risk? Again, OSHA, just to keep on that theme, notwithstanding the rejection by the United States Supreme Court of OSHA's ability to issue that emergency temporary standard mandating vaccines for any employee who works for an employer with more than 100 employees, OSHA still has the authority to cite employers for not providing a safe workplace. It's under the General Duties Clause. So that's always a possibility. So for instance, how could this come up? Well, it doesn't require an OSHA investigator on their own just to be, driving down the road and think, I'm going to pull in here today and see how this employer is handling their work environment. Actually, more likely they get a call from an employee who is saying, hey, my employer is not following CDC guidance, for instance. They're not requiring employees to quarantine if they've been exposed to people who've been sick or who've been tested positive for COVID, or they're not otherwise behaving in a safe way. And so that's going to be more likely the way that OSHA would find out about it, an issue, and come and pay you a visit. We go to the next slide. So in terms of this risk analysis, what's the next step in terms of assessing this? This is where it kind of gets down to like how realistic is this claim or this exposure? Are you really at risk? And so, we talk about those first category of claims of, something you do as an employer or fail to do deviates from the CDC guidance, or the arguable standard of care, and somebody claims that they got sick. So, these claims, especially with infectious diseases, can be very difficult to prove if you're the plaintiff, because if you're a human being, you're going to be out and about in the community, just living at home, being exposed to people who are in your family or in the community as you go to work, on the subway or wherever, going to the grocery store. To say that you got an infection at work is possible, it's plausible, but to the extent that there are other potential sources, then that's maybe difficult for a plaintiff to prove. And obviously, if you're a resident in a nursing home, that's maybe a lot easier. You don't move, and so to the extent that you get sick, you had to get sick from somebody. But it could have been from the roommate. It could have been from the family member who came to visit the roommate. And it wasn't the employer necessarily. So again, these kinds of cases tend to be hard to prove if they're based in negligence. Again, especially with an infectious disease like COVID. And I think that the standard of care in 2020 is very likely different then than it is today. Heck, you turn on the television today or last night, I saw a baseball game, and it was in Canada, and the Red Sox were playing, and there must have been, I don't know, I think I could count the number of people in one hand who were wearing a mask in that stadium with tens of thousands of people. But if that were 2 years ago, well, that'd look very different. And so I think it's worth noting, like, what is the current mindset of people? And I think there was a real fear 2 years ago that you were going to get sued. If somebody came into your business, or you had a customer or an employee and they got sick, by man, they're gonna blame me. And if you're in a business that is relies on your reputation as providing a safe product or workplace, whether it's healthcare, education, could be transportation, pilots, airlines. Like, boy, we cannot risk even having the accusation that we're not providing a safe workplace or safe environment for our customers, for our employees. And so, that was the mindset in 2020, and I think arguably into 2021. But I think today that's certainly evolved. Again, 2 years ago, many may remember that wedding up in Millinocket, Maine, that was at an inn where at the reception, very few or anybody was wearing a mask, and then there was an outbreak, and some people who didn't even go to the wedding got infected from some of the guests, and then 1 or 2 people died. And there was some litigation that came out of that, and I think that may have been settled, because I haven't heard anything about it in the last 2 years. But ever since then, it's been pretty quiet. That feared tidal wave of litigation against businesses for not providing a safe environment for customers, safe mainly to prevent infection, has not materialized. So I think the risk of that needs to be reevaluated and maybe just diminished significantly. I mean, I can't count how many people I know who've got kids in college who've gotten, their kids have gotten sick while gotten COVID while at college. And they come home or they get quarantined or whatever, but I can't think of anybody ever saying to me, boy, I'm going to sue that college because my kid got sick there. Nobody said that, which isn't to say that people don't think about it or don't threaten. But I think that today in 2022, that kind of claim has become pretty well. I don't perceive that it's a real realistic threat. What's another kind of case in terms of exposure? And it's another point to make on the exposure of those claims. Again, to the extent that the survival rate from COVID is up in the 99% range still, or even improving, especially for the lower age demographics of the working class age groups, that's another factor to consider. And the rates of hospitalization are going down, and the number of severe outcomes continue to go down. And again, all of that plays into what is your real exposure for that kind of claim arising out of a negligence. And again, and that's where the CDC guidance really comes to bear, is on those sorts of claims. What about a claim from an employee for the refusal to accommodate their medical condition or religious belief? And, where, does the CDC guidance help you there? It could maybe say, hey, look, I can't allow any unvaccinated person to work in my business because the CDC guidance says, you're a risk, and I don't want you getting a customer or coworker sick, because the coworker might get sick and then be out of work, and then I'm going to have a staffing issue, and then so I'm just going to keep you out. That's too much of a hardship. And that's an argument to make, but it's worth remembering that in those kinds of cases, the CDC guidance is going to run into a conflict with the EEOC guidance, so the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which says that if you're going to be, when you're evaluating a request for an accommodation for a medical condition, there needs to be a reasonable belief based on objective evidence that an employee will pose a direct threat to the health or safety of herself or others. And you see, I underline the phrase based on objective evidence. And so question arises, well, is the CDC guidance, is that objective evidence? Maybe, I haven't seen a lot of test cases. Presumably the guidance is based on objective evidence that comes from the CDC. But I would say that it's not a given that a court would say that the CDC guidance is the same thing as objective evidence. So for instance, if the employee comes in with an expert that says, hey, I'm an expert in epidemiology, and my patient here, it presents no risk to himself or herself or others. They got infected with the virus in April 2020. They had their blood tested, they had antibodies, and I tested it again. They still have robust antibodies. And based on my expert opinion, this person who's unvaccinated but has natural immunity poses no greater risk of infection to himself or others than a vaccinated person. so that you have that expert opinion going against the CDC guidance, so which one is going to trump? I don't know, but I would say that the CDC guidance is going to have less utility in that kind of employment discrimination claim. And then you have to ask, well, okay, so what's the risk of getting an employment discrimination claim today versus a negligence claim from a customer today? I don't know. Arguably, the employment discrimination claims have probably been about the same in terms of the level of risk in the last couple of years. Next slide. So in terms of, again, further risk analysis, one question that I think some people forget to think about is, do you have insurance for this? Is this going to be a business crushing claim or not? And the answer is, if you have like a customer or other resident, let's say if you're a nursing home and you get sued for negligence, you're generally going to have coverage for that. If you have an employee issue, most employers these days, many have employment practices liability insurance. And if it's if it's an employee who says they got sick while at work and because of work, let's say they work in healthcare, then you've got workers' comp insurance for that. And that's probably going to be covered. Although as I noted earlier, most of the carriers seem to be denying those claims. I do know of a few clients whose carriers have actually approved those claims without litigating them, depending on the facts. But those are, that you do have insurance for that kind of claim. And then you want to ask yourself, well, what's your deductible and what's your coverage limit? So maybe this perceived threat of litigation, of getting sued for not following some standard of care, and is not as devastating or great as you might imagine. As I mentioned a minute ago, what's the likelihood of getting sued on any one of these theories? I'd say, again, on the people getting sick in your workplace, that likelihood has gone down in the last 2 years. You always have to consider the potential damage to your reputation with a claim. Again, I think with the educational setting, 2 years ago, if you got sued by some students or their families because they got sick at school or work, that could be potentially devastating to a reputation. But today, probably less so. And the last question here on this is, which claim would you rather defend? And this is not a satisfying place to be, but it's often a place where we as lawyers find ourselves when we're advising clients, which is the better bad option here. Either course you do. If you do too much to mitigate infection from COVID, infection risk, or too little, you're going to have risk either way. So, one way to look at this by way of example is, okay, for COVID, let's say you have an employee or a student and they claim, who claims they got COVID because of your negligence and because you didn't make everybody get the vaccine. Is that claim, you didn't want that claim 2 years ago, or a year ago, I should say. But are you worried about that claim as much today? I don't know. As compared to, this is another kind of claim. Let's say you have a vaccine mandate for your employees or your customers. Like if you want to come into our gym, you have to have a vaccine. Or as a student, if you want to come to our school, you got to have a vaccine. But let's say that, the vaccine's got risks and the employee or the student or the customer claims, hey, that shot that I got, it gave me bad side effects. I now have myocarditis, a heart condition from that. You didn't properly warn me of the risks associated with getting that vaccine to go to work or to go to school or to go to your gym or do whatever. Which would you rather, is that the kind of claim you'd want to defend over the negligence claim for not having a vaccine mandate, for instance? I don't know. This could vary from one business to the next, but I think it's that kind of analysis that's really important to help you understand what your risks are. And I would say that some of these vaccine side effect cases are starting to come to the fore. That's a trend that we're keeping an eye on carefully. So that's that's my take on the risk analysis, and this is pretty complicated, and thank you for enduring that. But at this point, I will turn it over to Emily, who will talk about adjusting or considerations for adjusting vaccine requirements.
Great. So as we think about that risk analysis and look towards, perhaps you're in an organization that has a vaccine mandate or wants to implement a vaccine mandate, or wants to change it. These are the things that you potentially should be thinking about as you go through that consideration process. So first, the first factor is really, the sentiment around vaccine mandates. In the beginning of the pandemic and the rollout of the vaccines, there was really a belief that vaccines prevented infection, transmission, and the severity of symptoms. And, I think we have to kind of consider, have those thoughts shifted at all? And when I say that, on the one hand, I'm talking about, nationally or in the United States or what have you, but also at the organizational level. What's your pulse on your employee population and how potential employee or a plaintiff could put together an argument that whether vaccines are necessary or how they would feel about it being mandated or lifted. And we'll review some data on this on the coming slides. It's also worth considering, do people still have the same faith in public health authorities? We'll kind of go into some quotes and just how the situation has changed and, how the CDC has updated their guidance and what impact that could potentially be having on your employee population. Finally, on this point as well, it's also important to consider what other companies are doing. If you have a mandate or don't have a mandate, to a certain extent, there is some protection in being part of a group or an industry that's, pushing or not pushing a mandate, rather than being, the sole actor kind of taking a certain course. Rob had already mentioned claims against companies by employees and customers for contracting COVID due to the company's negligence. These claims really, from what we've seen, have been quite rare. In the beginning of the pandemic, I remember this was kind of a huge issue, and certainly on our end, and I imagine for many of you as well, there were constantly legal debates, articles, analysts commenting on this issue, saying all these lawsuits were going to be coming about. And from our perspective, we really just haven't seen that manifest. Another consideration is, will you have some employees be anxious or angry if the mandates are dropped? Again, this is an organizational analysis. You all know your employees best and how they might potentially react. But, I do think also that the level of anxiety over COVID may have shifted over the last 2 years now that we have vaccines, now that we don't have, mandates in place from a local or state level. So that's also something to consider. So, along this vein as well, as we think about, employee perception of the state of the pandemic, I did just want to share a couple of quotes from this week, actually, this past Tuesday. On the one hand, we have the director of the CDC, Director Walensky, who said, in a news article, we do believe that there is a lot of protection in the community, both from vaccination as well as from boosting and from prior infection. And I just want to highlight this because this is, different than what the CDC has traditionally been saying over the past 2 years in terms of accounting for natural immunity as kind of counting towards, safety in the community, reducing the risk of reinfection. So that's, something new that might resonate with employees, it might not, but just worth mentioning. And then, on the same day earlier this week, Dr. Fauci on PBS's News Hour gave an interview where he said, we are certainly right now in this country out of the pandemic phase. So, potentially this reflects, maybe an employee perception of how severe the situation is, or potentially, messaging from the government as to, what they want employees to kind of feel. Maybe they're trying to ease anxiety a little bit, but worth mentioning because this is a little bit of a break from the messaging that we've seen over the last 2 years. The next two questions on the slide are ones that, we don't really have concrete answers to, but there are certainly things that you should keep in mind as you go through this analysis in your organizations. So the first one is, if a company is dropping a vaccine mandate, will you rehire employees who were fired for refusing the vaccine? That's going to be a tricky decision to kind of come to as an employer. But certainly, if you did find yourself in that situation, something that you'd have to, consider before you rolled that decision out. And then secondly, is dropping the mandate an admission that any requests for medical or religious accommodation were wrongly denied? I think that throughout the last 2 years, everyone's been trying to do the best that they can with the information that's available and make the best decisions for their organizations. But that might be something that you're confronted with, by an employee who feels a certain way about it, and just being prepared to address those questions or those concerns is incredibly important. Next slide, please. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some CDC data that might be helpful to consider as you make this decision. So this is a little small, so please bear with me. But on this slide, we have CDC data showing the daily trends in the number of COVID-19 cases in the United States. So obviously here you can see a massive spike in January of 2022. And the last date on this chart is April 25th, 2022. So just this past Monday. So, April obviously looks significantly lower than January. So, this could potentially feed into your analysis of whether to maintain or lift a vaccine mandate. Perhaps this is data that you could continue to review over the coming months to see if that changes your analysis as to your mandate. Maybe that's something that you would monitor over the next year and kind of see mirroring 2021 and 2022. What does that look like? Is there a significant change or not? But just, data that could potentially help you as you make that decision. Next slide, please. So some more CDC data to look at. This chart is showing hospitalization rates. So you can see the green line is the rate in fully vaccinated persons, and the blue line is the rate in unvaccinated persons, if you can't read that key. So basically what the chart is showing is that if employees get vaccinated, there's a lower risk of them getting a bad case of COVID. So this data could form the basis of a business justification for continuing a vaccine mandate. For example, your vaccinated employees get COVID, this chart would support the idea that if they're vaccinated, they can return to work sooner because they're not going to have as severe of a case. But as we talk, the title of this presentation is where the goalposts have shifted. If you look at the data, some of you might be saying, it looks like the two lines are getting closer. It looks like that unvaccinated line is getting closer to that vaccinated line. So do we have, as much as of a basis to kind of mandate this vaccine if unvaccinated people could also come back to work sooner? And that's, potentially something to consider. And I think it really emphasizes the importance of continuing to look at these metrics and making the best decisions that you can for your organizations as the trends change or stay the same. But just kind of an interesting tidbit there. And then a few more statistics for you. So these really show that the spread of COVID has become quite prevalent. So the CDC reports that 60% of the US population, including 75% of children, show signs of COVID-19 infection as of February 2022. And then during March of 2022, 60% of cases in Massachusetts and 88% of cases in Maine were found in fully vaccinated individuals. So, if you're a part of an organization that doesn't have a vaccine mandate in place right now, to the extent that you're worried about being accused of being negligent about customers or students getting COVID, a significant portion of the population has been exposed and has been infected at this stage in the pandemic. So to Rob's point about the analysis earlier, this potentially could be helpful for you in defending a claim if you were to experience one, as to, this could have come from many different sources, not necessarily your organization. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob to talk about different employers mandating the vaccine.
Yeah, great. So what are employers doing? And just before we move on, the data that Emily was just referring to in terms of the state of Maine and Massachusetts, in terms of what's the percentage of breakthrough cases, that data came right from the Department of Health in Massachusetts and from the Maine CDC. They publish that data weekly. Actually, the Mass CDC or Mass Public Health data is published in the Boston Globe every day. So anybody can, they don't present it that way, but you can easily do the math by just seeing the number of, take a time period, pick the number of new cases, the number of new breakthrough cases, and then it's just a simple matter of division at that point. So in terms of, what are other employers doing? Well, this was a recent article in Bloomberg, so it was a chart that we've borrowed from them, but very interesting, and it reports on an upcoming survey from Willis Towers Watson of a couple thousand employers. And basically, this just shows that about half the employers in the country implemented a vaccine mandate, but that half is shrinking on the mandate side, and looks as though the now down to about a third of employers have a vaccine mandate. And I assume some of those are in the category of healthcare providers, which is a significant part of the economy, who have to under the federal CMS mandate and also the respective state healthcare mandates, like in Maine and Massachusetts and New York. So query, if employers are left to their own devices, I don't know what that number would be. It'd probably be less than 33%. But you could see that the trend is certainly to drop vaccine mandates, and some pretty high profile employers who very openly, like Google, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Boeing, they all rolled out vaccine mandates pretty early on, very publicly. They have now sort of quietly walked back from them and dropped them. Google a couple of weeks ago, JP Morgan also, whether that's because they perceive that the risk has changed, like we just were talking about, the numbers and the metrics suggest that the need to have these mandates no longer as easily justified business grounds. Also could be employee retention. We understand that we're hearing through the grapevine that some employers who have vaccine mandates and they advertise it aren't getting as good a response, especially if they say you need to be boosted. And I think, as Emily said earlier, there's the definition of fully vaccinated versus up to date, which implies a booster, and query whether that includes a fourth booster for some categories. So anyway, this, I think it's good to know where you stand in terms of the pack of employers and your current policy. Next slide, please. So this is some data that I think is also worth keeping in mind in terms of what's it like today? What's the current snapshot with respect to infection rates? We heard many times in the last year that we had a pandemic of the unvaccinated. They're the ones driving this pandemic, and that may have been true a year ago, but you haven't heard that phrase so much anymore. And this slide might explain why. I came across this data just a few days ago, last week, and it was published by Walgreens, which is common. Everybody knows Walgreens, nationwide pharmacy chain, and they have been very active in testing for COVID, and they started publishing their data a couple months ago. Again, I just found it last week, but I started looking at it, and the way they slice the data is they break it out by various categories, and be prepared. I mean, this is real sort of paradigm shifting data potentially, but it's certainly worth noting. I mean, this is not just a fly by night organization. I mean, this is Walgreens, and they do about 70,000 tests every week, at least, that are put into this data across the nation. And I've given you the link to their website. And these are just two screenshots, or one screenshot that we're providing to you, but it's on page 3 of the data. So if you go to page 3, it has positivity rate by vaccination status, and you'll see the 6 categories there. And just interestingly, and maybe again amazingly, the one group that has the lowest rate of infection of the 6 categories, which is 1 dose, 2 doses greater than 5 months ago, 2 doses less than 5 months ago, 3 doses, or meaning boosted more than 5 months ago, and 3 doses were boosted less than 5 months ago. The lowest rate of infection is among the unvaccinated, which is very surprising to see that data. And and if you on the age categories, if you break it down by age, you can click when you get to the website through ages 5 to 11, 12 to 17, the working ages of 18 to 44 and 45 to 64. That's an important demographic from our perspective. The data is consistent across every single age category. And so that is quite surprising. And further, if you look at the difference between the 2 people who were boosted recently and more, and farther back in history versus 2 doses, there's not a significant difference between having a 2-dose person versus a boosted dose. So again, this is, I think, relevant, potentially relevant. There are other data sets out there, but this struck me as a pretty reliable source without too much skin in the game in terms of what the data shows. Obviously, they make money from testing, so maybe the more infections they find, the more tests they get to perform. But again, noteworthy. And on the next slide, please. Again, to the extent that this data, if you question the reliability of it, I mean, you could see that the 4 data sets or the 4 groups that have the most data would be the unvaccinated, the 2 doses, and then the boosted group. The boosted group makes up half the data set. So these are some pretty significant numbers, enough to suggest that the data is not just as a random, as an artifact, a statistical artifact that's unreliable. So we can go to the next slide. And so, what are some possible takeaways from this Walgreens data? So, again, the assumption that an unvaccinated person poses a greater risk of infection than a vaccinated person, it's in question, at least for the Omicron variant. And that's really important to say. So I think, a year ago, I think this data would have been very different. But today, with respect to the Omicron variant, and you're making decisions today, there may be less of a strong case to differentiate between unvaccinated people versus vaccinated people in terms of how you treat them in the employment setting. Booster shots, at least with respect to the Omicron variant, they're not showing a great benefit, and that's actually consistent with some studies out of Israel that we've seen. So this is where reliance on CDC guidance, which may be based on older data, is probably less persuasive to customers, employees, or even a court. Again, and this is where I think perhaps if it's ever challenged, some of these are challenged further. Again, these challenges to the state vaccine mandates for healthcare, I think they're still percolating in the legal system. They were denied injunctive relief early on, but my understanding is those cases are still going forward. And it's possible that with this kind of data being considered, the court may ultimately decide that the rule is arbitrary. And that's a standard that's applied to any government regulation, that regulations are not supposed to be arbitrary and capricious. And if they are, then the court should reject them. So this kind of data may be used to challenge those kinds of regulations. In the meantime, of course, if you're in healthcare, you have to comply with the rules as they are. So, it's also important not to put too much reliance on the Walgreens data. It's just one data set, wasn't a randomized study. Doesn't address the possible benefit of reduced symptoms from getting vaccinated. Again, as Emily touched on, there's certainly a legitimate business justification for saying, hey, if you get vaccinated, you're going to have fewer symptoms, and therefore you'll have a lower risk of being absent from work. And the public health authorities and other authorities are going to have access to different data. So again, not to put too much weight in the Walgreens data, but it is something that could be used against you as an employer if you try to treat an unvaccinated worker in a way that's less advantageous as a vaccinated person. And that's quite different today than it was a year ago. The data looked different. Next slide, please. And I'll turn this back to Emily.
So I know we're right at time, so I will try to go through this fairly quickly. But I did just want to bring up some considerations for mask requirements in the workplace. So kind of pivoting away from the vaccine conversation. Here we have two completely different scenarios. So I know, people can be really opinionated about masks, and, whether they want to wear them, whether or not they're effective, what have you. But here we have two polar opposite situations, for your consideration, depending on what your business is trying to implement. So can an employer require employees to wear a mask? The answer is yes, but an employee may reasonably refuse to wear a mask if the mask creates a hazardous or unsafe working environment. For example, if the mask prevents an employee from smelling or seeing a hazard, or if the mask aggravates a medical condition. On the flip side, can an employer require employees to not wear a mask? And the answer to this is it depends. On the one hand, we have the CDC guidelines, which say, we encourage you to wear a mask and to socially distance. So employees who work in this type of an environment where the employer says, I don't want you to wear a mask, they can kind of fall back on the CDC guidance and say, this is what I want to do. This makes me feel safe. And the CDC says that, I can do it, subject to all of the caveats that we talked about earlier in the presentation. An employee with a documented disability that, is aided or requires the use of wearing a mask would have an even stronger claim against that employer. To consider perhaps a hypothetical, maybe the employer requires employees to not wear a mask, and an employee comes forward and says, I'm anxious, I want to wear a mask in the workplace. Perhaps a general anxiety about that wouldn't necessarily merit a reasonable accommodation. It would be a factually intensive inquiry, but a specialized fear of not wearing a mask endorsed by a doctor is more likely to require a reasonable accommodation. Next slide, please. So here, we just wanted to quickly highlight for you the legal implications of remote work. So, quite frankly, we probably could have done a whole webinar on just this topic, but here are some things to just be mindful of that I'm sure you're already mindful of in your organizations that basically just relate to, if you have employees working in different states, every state has different state laws, and it's important to consider, what the rules are in the state in which they are working. And this also can, potentially be an impact for employees that want to request remote work as a reasonable accommodation. If you have employees that have been successfully, working from home over the last 2 years, it's obviously going to be much harder for the employer to say, that's not a reasonable accommodation that I want you to have in my organization if it's been proven to be successful. And there's also other requirements for your business too that you should be aware of. Some states, require an employer with certain levels of activities to register their business in the state where the employee is working. You could open up the door to have a taxable presence or nexus in a state that you wouldn't otherwise be operating in. And certainly, obligations for employment taxes and payroll deductions in that other state as well. And with that, I will turn it over to Rob.
Thanks, Emily. And here's our final slide. Just quickly to just touch on some more practical trends in terms of a post-pandemic workplace. People are, I know in our office, people are coming in more often, and but what happens when people haven't been working together and now they're back together more often? Well, mask shaming has been reported in the media. Like, we, like many employers, like, you want to wear a mask, wear a mask. That's fine. And are people going to be made to feel bad if they wear a mask? Are people going to say, geez, you must be immunocompromised, or what's the matter with you? Do you have anxiety? Obviously those are forms of bullying, and you want to be mindful that that doesn't happen, and try to mitigate that. Or even good-natured welcome back comments like, boy, it's great to see people from the waist down, that kind of thing. Be ready for those sorts of awkward greetings as people come back together. Maybe be mindful of an overemphasis of using alcohol to get people reacquainted, that sort of thing, happy hours and cocktail parties. And then the hybrid workforce. I mean, this is something that I think, putting aside the pandemic, or maybe let's say we put it in our rearview mirror, I think many commentators are saying this is going to be permanent. There's a new expectation that people can be allowed to and should be allowed to work from home at least part of the time, and this is reflected in surveys, and that this is not going away anytime soon in terms of hiring and retention. If employers who are insisting that employees be in the workplace 3 days a week, 4 days a week, they may not get people that they want to work for them. And I think that's a pretty significant paradigm shift for someone, especially for someone like me who's been in the workplace a long time. And what are some other modifications could include a shortened work week to 4 days, just by demand or by statute. Just worth noting that California, there's a bill in the California legislature right now that would shorten the work week, the statutory work week, to 32 hours. And if you work more than 32 hours, you get overtime. Stay tuned on that. Let's see if that is embraced and whether it spreads. And then other common issues would be hoteling of offices. Obviously, real estate expensive, and if people aren't coming in, you don't need as much office space. So I think there'll be a trend of shortening or shrinking of footprints and making employees share workspace. And that there's always been a lot of resistance to that, especially sort of white collar industries where people have their own office, their own hidey holes, and they don't want to share. So I think the expectation of sharing or hoteling is probably a little higher now, and that's something that you might be able to accomplish more easily. So with that, we've gone over by a few minutes. Thank you so much for your sitting in with us on this really interesting and ever-changing topic. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to Emily or to me, and we will get right back to you with some answers. And on that, as far as certification, I just wanted to clarify that you may have seen in the chat box that if you want your SHRM certificate, that's available online, and there's a link to it. And also these slides are also available as well. So thanks again, and we'll hopefully see you next month.